Happy Veterans Day, everyone, and welcome to the channel. So we're going to be talking about cerebrovascular circle of Willis and its artery supply, which is all coming from our internal carotid artery, and this is blood supply for our brain. So it's all happening in our cranium. So yeah, let's get it going. So just a reference, so keep in mind, so when we're talking about this, we're going to have 3 cerebral arteries and 3 cerebellar arteries. I think that's the hardest concept for people to understand, but when you know what to look for, it becomes a lot easier to identify, and with the naming as well. Use the names to your advantage. So when doing this, we're going to draw out a proper sized brain, and that way we can start tagging what we need to know and the positioning of the brain. So we need to know where the anterior and posterior sides of the brain are, and when you're doing that, the best way to do it is finding the cerebellum, which is going to have a glossy and more spider-like look and feel to it. So your cerebellum is going to be posterior, and then the other side, of course, is going to be your anterior side. So the circle of Willis is right in the middle, and it's going to have your internal carotid artery coming out. So you have your circle of Willis, and it's going to be jumbled with veins and whatnot, but we're just worried about the arteries right now. So this is your internal carotid artery, and once again, it only branches once it reaches the cranium. It does not branch before the cranium. That would be coming from your external carotid artery. So you have your internal carotid artery, and what I'm going to do for you guys is I'm going to draw the common named ones in the same color. That way we could better organize. So right off the internal carotid artery, we're going to have the middle cerebral artery, and that's going to go directly sideways or parallel. So it's going to go out to one side and out the other side. And you're not going to see too much of it because it's going to go inside the brain a bit, but it's a middle cerebral artery. And middle, using the name to our advantage, middle means that there's something above it and below it, or anterior and posterior. So keep that in mind. And I said already that there's 3 cerebral arteries, so we're going to try to draw those. And I kind of drew one right now. So greens are going to be your cerebral arteries. And what's connecting them? You're going to have a posterior communicating artery, which is a small artery just connecting the cerebral arteries. And that's going to connect the middle cerebral artery and the posterior, because we're now on the posterior side, posterior cerebral artery. And posterior communicating artery, just with that name, posterior, that means that there's going to be an anterior side as well. So we have our middle cerebral artery, our posterior cerebral artery now, and then our posterior communicating artery. So we're still looking for one cerebral artery, and so now we're going to get into the cerebellar arteries. So off of our posterior cerebral artery, we're going to have our superior cerebellar artery. So superior cerebellar artery. And superior is indicative of that we have an inferior cerebellar artery. And we're going to, in fact, have 2 inferior cerebellar arteries, which you guys will see in just a bit. So we have that. And then we're going to have another portion off of our posterior cerebral artery, and that's going to be a big guy called the basilar artery. And the basilar artery is going to have our pontines, and it's going to have our branch off of our vertebral artery, and it's going to have another artery, which we'll get to in just a minute. So these little guys are going to be our pontines, and it's going to supply like our pons, the pons area of the brain. And then they're just little branches, so there are going to be a lot of them and a lot of little branches off of our basilar artery. And our basilar artery is going to split and become our vertebral artery. Our vertebral artery. And so now we're going to look for our cerebellar arteries. So we know we have 2 inferior cerebellar arteries. So one's going to be coming off our basilar artery, and that one's going to be our anterior inferior cerebellar artery. Anterior gives us an indication that there's going to be a posterior. So we're going to do so first I wrote this a bit wrong, and I'm going to correct it right now, but it's going to be the anterior inferior cerebellar artery. And then anterior gives us an indication that there's going to be a posterior. So we're going to then have a posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which is then going to come off of our vertebral artery. So we have one right there. I drew it out on the gold, and that is going to be our posterior inferior cerebellar artery. That's our 3 cerebellar arteries, so we took care of those, and those are kind of indicative of the name and their positioning. So one's off our basilar and one's off of our vertebral artery. And our vertebral artery will have one more artery, which will be our anterior spinal artery. So it's going to be our anterior spinal artery. And that kind of comes off in between the offshoot of the vertebral V. So let's just do a cross check and figure out what we got. So we have 1 and 2 cerebral arteries. We have our middle cerebral artery and our posterior cerebral artery. So what else can we have? We would need the anterior cerebral artery, which will come in just a bit. We took care of our cerebellar arteries, so we have our superior cerebellar artery, and then we have both of our inferior cerebellar arteries, anterior and posterior. So we have 3 of our cerebellar arteries taken care of. Now we're just looking for our 3rd cerebral artery. And keep in mind, we have a posterior communicating artery, so that's indicative that we'll have an anterior communicating artery as well. So we're going to draw now our anterior cerebral artery, which is going to supply the front portion of our brain. So this is going to be it's in green. I told y'all I'm going to group them in colors, so that's going to be our anterior cerebral artery. And that's our 3rd and final cerebral artery. And what's going to connect them and communicate them is going to be our anterior communicating artery. So I'm going to draw that in orange. Anterior communicating artery. So we have 3 cerebellar arteries, 3 cerebral arteries, and we have a few that are singles, and we have 2 communicating arteries. So that's important to know so that you know what to look for coming in. And then you use the names to your advantage. So that sums up the arterial supply to the brain. So it's not too complicated. The posterior side has a little bit more, it's a little bit more complex, but the front area is really easy, and you can start however you want, but keep in mind that there's 3 cerebral, 3 cerebellum, and 2 communicating. So thank you guys for watching and tuning in. It's Adam's Science Tutor, and take care.